Thank you very much for being here this morning. So I am here to talk about a story map that I created back in 2019. It's called The Hunt for Delaware Boundary Monuments. So the gentleman on the cover image that you see on the left, his name is William Sanford Schenck. He goes by Sandy, and he is a geologist with the Delaware Geological Survey, and he had a 40-year career there. And I say had because he retired last year. During his career, he's been my mentor because not only is he a professional geologist, he is also extremely knowledgeable when it comes to mapping and cartography. So like I said, he mentored me through my entire career. He used to talk about this project that he worked on when he first started working there, right out of college. The project was he had to go around the state and he had to locate all of the boundary monuments that mark our boundary. So we have 179. Originally, they were all stone monuments. So he always had these fascinating stories about the work that he did, talked about the history of the boundary, which is a very complicated and interesting story. So before he retired, I was like, you know what, I really need to get all of this information documented before he leaves. And I thought, what better way to do it than to use a story map template? In talking with him, so I guess just to talk about the project first. So when he went around, first of all, he had to locate all of the monuments. He had to assess the condition that it was in. He had to determine whether it was in the correct location or not, because believe it or not, some people actually dug them out of the ground and moved them. Like for example, a lot of them are in farm fields, so the farmer, I guess when they're plowing their fields, there was this thing sticking up in the way, so they just decided to dig it up and put it on the edge of the cornfield. They had to work with NGS, or National Geodetic Survey, to come out, resurvey the correct location and put the monument back in its place, or put it back in its place, in the incorrect way, but to know exactly where it is. Either that, or if it was completely missing altogether, they had to put a brass disc in its place. So I really had a fun time. Oh, so here's a picture I had to put of Sandy as a young man when he first started. And actually, so it was right after the 1970s, so it was early 80s, and there was an oil crisis, if anybody remembers back then. So a geologist had a difficult time finding a job. So he was almost ready to take a job being a bartender on a cruise ship because he couldn't find a job. But luckily, this job came along. So anyway, sitting down and talking with him, trying to figure out what was the most relevant, most interesting parts of his stories. I started to write my story. And then as I was going along, I had to think about my audience and think, okay, there's probably going to be a lot of people that aren't familiar with Delaware's boundary history or about the monuments itself. So then I started talking about the history a lot, and then I realized I was deviating from the topic of the actual recovery work and talking about the history. So I spent 2 months struggling with this problem, and I finally just kind of threw my hands up in the air and said, I can't do this anymore. The only way that I could solve that was to create a whole separate story. So then I made 2 stories. So I had one story specifically about the history, which, like I said, is complicated, but I kind of pared it down to what I thought was important. So the reader can jump over here, get themselves more information, and then I could focus a little bit more on Sandy's work here. So that was hurdle 1. Then just to talk about the boundaries themselves. So we have what we consider 4 major boundaries. So starting with the southernmost boundary, that's called the east-west boundary. That one, colonial surveyors put a stone monument at every 5 miles. And then in the 1970s, the Delaware and New Jersey, or I'm sorry, this is Maryland, the Delaware and Maryland boundary commissions got together and decided they wanted to have 1 mile brass discs put in between the 5-mile stones. So those were placed in the 70s. Then on the westernmost boundary, what's called north-south, that's actually part of the Mason-Dixon line. And that one has a stone monument every mile. And at every 5 miles, it's called a crown stone, because that one's a special stone. So it has the coat of arms of Calvert, which is Maryland, and then Penn, which is Pennsylvania. So actually, this was before Delaware became Delaware. It was actually the lower 3 counties of Pennsylvania at the time. So we were Pennsylvania. So those monuments are there. And then the northernmost is between Delaware and Pennsylvania. That is this arc boundary that you see. And this is part of what's called the 12-mile circle, and it's too complicated a story to get into. You'd have to read the history story to read about that, but there's something called the 12-mile circle that created this arc. And on this arc, there are stones. They were more recent stones that were quarried in southern Pennsylvania, and they are marked at every half mile, I guess, to account for the arc. And then we have Delaware and New Jersey. So you're looking at this boundary and you might be wondering, what the heck is this all about? Typically, cartographically, you think of Delaware having the boundary along our shoreline, along the bay, and then we have a little bit of Atlantic Ocean here. But this is actually the true boundary between us and Jersey. So what happened was, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Delaware and New Jersey started fighting over the rights to the Delaware River. Shad fishing became very popular. The oyster industry was booming. So each state wanted to have rights to the river. So it actually got to the point it went to court. And in 1934, the court determined that Delaware won. So our arc actually crosses over the river, over to the Jersey shoreline, and follows the Jersey shoreline. Now, this is the shoreline from 1934. This is the 1934 mean low water line. So we all know that erosion happens, so over time, this line is shifted, so it's actually kind of offshore now. So I guess Jersey did acquire a little bit of water now somewhere. And it follows south until you get to a particular point, and all of a sudden it makes a hard left or towards the west. And it's not a straight line. This is actually part of that 12-mile circle I talked about. So once it hits the 12-mile circle, it follows the 12-mile circle line to the center of, it doesn't look center on this map, but it's what they calculated to be the center of the shipping channel. And then it follows the center all the way down. So at this point we decided, okay, Jersey, we'll split it half and half with you. And then we'll follow it all the way down till it goes to the opening where the Atlantic Ocean is. So this is actually truly the boundary between us and Jersey. So just for everybody's knowledge. So I'm going to now jump over and talk about a couple of things that I kind of had to do to tweak the story to help me out. So I'm going to go to the history. So the bottom left corner of Delaware is called Middle Point. Whole other story about that. It's the middle point of a line that was a transpeninsula line that was drawn on the peninsula, and that's the very middle point. And there's a pavilion here. And in this pavilion, there's actually multiple monuments, and you're probably wondering why. Shouldn't there just be one to mark it? So I explain in here. So when I was explaining about each one, and in parentheses I had to put, monument on right, monument on left, monument center rear, in text to explain which one I was talking about. But then I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could use a vignette to just kind of spotlight each one? So I went in Photoshop, and it took me a little bit to figure out the right tools. I found the right YouTube video to figure out how to finally do it, and then I finally figured out how to do this. So I created my vignette to spotlight, and then also, I had to just keep the rest of it a little transparent so I could still see my image, but now I'm focused and I could take out the parentheses with description now. And so then each one, as you scroll, you talk about each one. I was so excited when I got this figured out. Yay. And this Alan Carroll from StoryMaps, he uses this technique a lot as well. So that was one. And let's see, the second thing I wanted to talk about, let me go back here. So I'm going to jump down to the section of the story. Oh, and if you're just wondering too, these are the 5-mile monuments. Why is there one missing? That's actually the area is called Great Cypress Swamp. So even back then, the colonial guys could not get out there. So they couldn't put a monument there. I think today we couldn't, or if we did, it would sink. So that's why there's not one there. There wasn't a mistake. And those are the discs that were put in between. So I'm going to go past Middle Point. I'm going to talk about the monuments that were along that Mason-Dixon line. So there's quite a few monuments there. There were a lot of interesting stories about each one. So I wanted to talk about, describe a little bit of story, have a picture for each one, have the name of the monument, the location. I also wanted a locator map just to kind of give the person an idea of where they were each time. But at the time I was struggling because I was like, okay, I've got an image, I've got text, and I've got another image of the map. But then the map kind of either had to go above or below the text, and I couldn't put it alongside because the picture was next to the text already. So the only way I could do it was I created what I call a banner. So I have actually a rectangular image here that I created in Illustrator. So then I was able to put my little cartoon of the cartographic outline of Delaware with the point location next to my text. And then in the background, I did the best that I could to make the color the same as the template background. So I'm hoping I'm fooling everybody. I can tell by looking at it the color's a little off. Now that you all know, if you look at the story, you're going to look at it carefully, but just pretend you don't see that. I actually, at the time, fooled one of the StoryMap's team members because he was wondering how I did this. So when I explained it to him, he was like, wow, that's a great idea. I was like, maybe work that into your template a little bit, too. So now, as you're scrolling, you can talk about each one. Now, between 1 and 5, there's not much distance between the two. But then if you go to 17, you see I'm going further north. So for each one, I just wanted to give people a feeling of where they were, is all. So then I accomplished that with this technique here. And Sandy's so cute when he's standing at the pictures of the monuments. So I think that's, I would love to talk more about it, but I'm limited on time. We have other great presentations. So I encourage everybody to please go take a look at the story. And actually, if you just go online and search for the Hunt for Delaware Boundary Monuments, or even just the keywords Hunt and Delaware Boundary Monuments, you should be able to find the direct link to it, the StoryMap's link. But if you do have trouble, if you search also for First Map Delaware, that's our enterprise GIS, and they recently switched over to a hub site. So this is their home page, and if you go to their First Map hub, when you scroll down, they've got their featured applications down there, and hopefully it's still there. I don't think I checked it this morning, but we were the first one listed, and I don't know why it's not coming up, but anyway, we were the first one there, but our applications are listed there if you can't find it directly. I will also, since I haven't been using Slack, I should jump on Slack for this room, and I can put the link there too. But please, I encourage everybody to read Sandy's story. It's very interesting, and then the history one as well. And I think I'll just wrap up there. So thank you.